No one could have predicted what would unfold on this routine flight. It was just another day in the sky, passengers settling in, the hum of the airplane filling the cabin. But as the flight attendant walked down the aisle, her eyes caught sight of a woman sitting quietly by the window, a black woman dressed in a modest but striking outfit, a sparkly metallic skirt that caught the light in a way that no one expected. The flight attendant paused, her gaze lingering for a moment too long. Something about this woman bothered her. Perhaps it was the way she dressed, or perhaps it was the quiet confidence she exuded. The flight attendant's eyes narrowed, an unspoken judgment clouding her thoughts. Her focus was entirely on her task, oblivious to the curious glances of the other passengers. She walked up to the black woman's seat with an air of authority, the hum of the engines accompanying her steps. When she reached the woman, her voice was sharp, cutting through the quiet atmosphere. "You know," the flight attendant began, "you look a bit out of place here. I'm afraid you don't meet our airline's standards, not just your dress, but your overall appearance. It's against our policy." The black woman's gaze remained calm, unblinking. She did not respond immediately. For a few moments, there was a strange silence between them, as if the world outside had ceased to exist. The flight attendant's words hung in the air like an accusation. It was clear. She didn't think the woman belonged, but the black woman didn't flinch. She didn't say a word. She simply sat there, her posture unchanged, as if the insult had never been spoken. What happened next would surprise everyone on the plane. The tension between them built slowly, but it wasn't until the flight attendant took another step forward that things started to spiral. No one saw it coming. For a moment, everything seemed frozen. The black woman kept her eyes fixed straight ahead, but something in her posture subtly shifted. The flight attendant, still standing in front of her, waited for some sort of reaction. She expected a confrontation, perhaps an argument. Instead, the black woman remained silent. The passengers around them noticed the tension. Some glanced nervously, unsure of what to make of the exchange. The usual hum of the airplane now seemed louder than before, as if the entire cabin was holding its breath. The flight attendant cleared her throat, waiting for the black woman to respond. But still, there was nothing. In the midst of the silence, the flight attendant's discomfort grew. Why wasn't she reacting? Her mind raced, growing impatient. She had dealt with plenty of difficult passengers, but this woman's calmness was infuriating. The flight attendant's thoughts drifted back to the woman's attire, sparkly, shiny, and to her eyes, inappropriate. It was too much. It didn't fit in with the polished image the airline tried to project. But the black woman didn't flinch. She didn't speak a word. She simply continued to sit there, as though she was lost in thought, the only sound in the cabin being the occasional rustle of passengers shifting in their seats. The flight attendant, trying to regain control of the situation, took a step closer. "You know," she said again, more forcefully now, "this is not acceptable behavior. You are a poor example of what our passengers should look like. You really need to reconsider your wardrobe choices." The words hung in the air like an accusation, her tone colder than before. But the black woman still didn't respond. Her silence spoke volumes, yet it was more unnerving than any outburst could have been. The flight attendant was beginning to regret her words, but it was already too late. The silence continued to stretch, unbroken. The passengers, having picked up on the uncomfortable exchange, were now whispering among themselves. A few of them seemed to be waiting for something to happen, while others just looked awkward, unsure of how to intervene. And then, as if to break the tension, the flight attendant's patience snapped. Without warning, she grabbed the black woman's dress. Her fingers clutched the fabric with more force than necessary, and in one swift motion, she ripped it. Gasps filled the cabin as the sound of fabric tearing echoed across the aisle. The woman's face twisted in disbelief, her shock quickly morphing into fury. She stood up, her chair scraping against the floor, her body now towering over the flight attendant. Her voice was low but filled with a simmering rage. "How dare you!" she growled, her voice steady but furious. She stepped back, instinctively pulling the fabric of her now ruined skirt to cover herself. The passengers were stunned into silence. Eyes darted from one figure to the other, unsure of what would happen next. The flight attendant stood frozen for a moment, her own shock mingling with a growing sense of shame. She had crossed a line. No one on this flight had expected this. The flight attendant's eyes widened with realization. She had just torn the dress of a passenger. No, not just any passenger. This woman was different. The black woman wasn't reacting as expected. Instead of screaming or fighting back, she remained unnervingly calm. There was something about her that made everyone else in the cabin uneasy. The woman pulled out her phone with surprising speed. The passengers around her watched as she dialed a number, her fingers moving with a quiet confidence. What was she doing? Everyone stared, their eyes wide with curiosity. Some passengers whispered, but the murmurs only grew louder as they waited for her to speak. And then, the woman spoke into the phone, calmly but clearly. "Yes, I'd like to purchase this airline." The stunned silence that followed was deafening. The entire cabin seemed to freeze. The flight attendant, who was still standing there, dumbfounded, couldn't comprehend what she had just heard. Did she say, "Purchase the airline"? The passengers exchanged confused looks. Was this a joke? Was this woman actually telling the truth? No one could quite believe it, but there was a certainty in the black woman's tone that made everyone uneasy. Something was different about her. Something no one had expected. The conversation on the phone was brief but powerful. When the woman hung up, she leaned back in her seat, glancing up at the flight attendant. A small, knowing smile tugged at the corners of her lips, but she didn't say anything. Meanwhile, passengers were still processing what had just occurred. Some exchanged nervous glances, others tried to stay focused on their own business, but the air was thick with uncertainty. The black woman seemed unbothered, almost serene despite the confrontation. The flight attendant, on the other hand, was visibly rattled. She took a step back, glancing toward the cockpit, almost as if expecting someone to intervene. But nothing happened. The tension hung in the air, unspoken, as the woman remained seated, cool and composed. But the atmosphere was about to shift dramatically. Just minutes passed before the flight attendant's worst nightmare was realized. A voice came over the intercom, clear and calm, but it cut through the tense atmosphere like a knife. "Attention all passengers, we have an important announcement to make." The voice paused, and then the words that followed sent ripples of shock through the cabin. "Effective immediately, the black woman seated in row 12 has become the new owner of this airline. She has purchased the company, and we now ask for your cooperation as we transition management. The incident earlier was regrettable, and we apologize for the behavior of our flight attendants." The words echoed through the cabin. The passengers sat frozen, many of them staring at the black woman with disbelief. Some were nodding slowly, trying to process the information, while others simply shook their heads in disbelief. The flight attendant's face turned pale. The same woman she had judged, the same woman she had humiliated, was now in charge. And the realization hit her hard. The flight attendant swallowed hard. She was no longer the one in control. In fact, she was the one who had made a grave mistake. She turned slowly, looking at the black woman. Her face was filled with embarrassment, regret, and guilt. With the announcement still ringing in her ears, the reality of what she had done began to sink in. She approached the woman, her steps hesitant, unsure of what to say. She cleared her throat before speaking, the words coming out shakily. I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I shouldn't have judged you. I was wrong." The black woman, still calm, nodded slightly. She wasn't angry. There was no fury in her eyes, Instead, there was something else, a quiet understanding. "I forgive you," the black woman said softly, her tone still unwavering. "But I want you to remember this. Never judge someone by their appearance or their clothes. We're all equal." And with that, she settled back into her seat, as if the matter had been closed. The flight attendant stood for a moment longer, her face still flushed with shame, before slowly turning to walk away. The cabin fell into an eerie silence. Everyone had witnessed something extraordinary. Passengers exchanged a few quiet words, processing the strange series of events that had just unfolded. As the plane flew through the skies, the atmosphere had shifted. There was a sense of respect now for the woman in row 12. The flight attendant had learned her lesson the hard way, but there was still something lingering in the air. Would the black woman, now the owner of the airline, make changes to the company? What would the consequences be for the flight attendant and others involved in the incident? The answers remained uncertain, but one thing was clear. The balance of power had shifted in a way no one could have predicted. Over the next few hours, passengers began to whisper about the woman's true identity. Some were still skeptical, but others were convinced that they had witnessed history in the making. The black woman was no longer just a passenger. She was the owner, and that meant everything had changed. The flight attendants were on edge, unsure of what to expect next. They were all nervous, some still unsure of how to treat the woman now that they knew who she was. But the black woman remained composed, her presence calming despite the uncertainty surrounding her. The flight landed, and the passengers disembarked, leaving with their own thoughts and questions. As for the flight attendant, her role in the airline's future seemed uncertain. The plane touched down softly, the engines humming as it approached its final destination. Passengers slowly began gathering their belongings, a quiet murmur running through the cabin. The tension that had once filled the air was now replaced by something else: curiosity, awe, and respect. As the black woman stood to leave, she moved through the aisle with a quiet confidence, her back straight and her head held high. No longer just another passenger, she was now the owner of the airline, the same airline that had once attempted to humiliate her. Her calm demeanor was unshaken, as if the chaos of the past few hours had not touched her at all. The flight attendants, once authoritative figures, now moved aside as she passed. They were unsure how to treat her, this woman, who had just bought the airline. They had witnessed something that would haunt them forever, but the black woman showed no signs of anger. There was no vengeance in her eyes. Instead, her expression held a quiet resolve, as if she had accomplished exactly what she had set out to do. The flight attendant, who had humiliated her earlier, stood frozen near the galley, her gaze fixed on the woman. She felt a deep wave of shame and embarrassment. She had misjudged this woman completely, assumed that her dress and appearance defined her worth. Now she was faced with the harsh reality of her mistake. As the black woman passed her, she glanced over. The flight attendant's eyes were downcast, unable to meet hers. But the black woman's voice was steady and gentle, though there was a firmness to it. "Remember this lesson," she said softly, but her words were clear, reaching beyond just the flight attendant. "Don't judge people by their clothes or their background. Not everyone who looks a certain way is poor, and not everyone who dresses a certain way is rich." There was no bitterness in her voice, no anger, just wisdom. She had learned a long time ago that appearances could be deceiving, and she had just shown the world how powerful that lesson could be. The flight attendant nodded slightly, a wordless apology in her gesture. The black woman didn't need to hear the apology. She knew it was already understood. She had achieved what she set out to do, not just to defend her dignity, but to teach the people around her, including the flight attendant, something important about humanity. The passengers who had witnessed the unfolding drama had also learned something. They had seen firsthand how easily someone could be judged and how wrong that judgment could be. As the black woman walked off the plane and into the terminal, she was met with a mixture of curious glances, some full of respect, others still processing the unexpected turn of events. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. She had made her point. She had taken control. And she had earned her respect, not through money or status, but through her character and the lesson she had imparted to everyone on board. It was a lesson that would stay with them forever. Never judge a book by its cover. Because sometimes, the most powerful stories are the ones we least expect.